Matthew David Segal. Thank you for joining me again, sir, to discuss a very important topic. I suppose, to give people an insight to the framing of this. What I've observed on your channel really is that you're tracking this change that's going on in the broader zeitgeist, in some sense, in science. You obviously had conversations about it in physics, in biology with Michael Levin, that the scientific ontology is changing. Maybe the substance ontology is, running out, that there's questions about new things emerging. And so, I wanted to really get your opinion on this metaphysical revolution and maybe help kind of catch people up to what's going on with it. So first of all, do you think there is a metaphysical revolution? Do you think this is, is this actually happening? And how do you think about it?
Yeah, well, good to be back with you, Mahon. And yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I have to acknowledge there might be a little bit of selection bias, because these scientists who are interested in pushing the envelope and changing the paradigm are looking around for philosophers who can help them work out, the concepts that are at play here. And so because of my interest in Whitehead, I hear from these cutting edge scientists who are looking for that new metaphysics. And so it could just be that they're finding me, and that what's going on in terms of the broader scientific community, I'm not really sure, but I would like to think that there's a kind of metaphysical revolution underway, both in physics and in biology. Obviously, I think physics underwent its own major revolution. Sometimes it's called the second scientific revolution, about over a century ago, both with quantum physics and relativity theory. And the metaphysical background of that has been difficult to work out. And so I think there's more recognition of the open questions in physics, and physicists tend to be more open to philosophy, to theology, to the place of consciousness in the universe being, somewhat more expansive than just something going on inside the skull. Whereas biologists, for whatever reason, have been more metaphysically conservative, I think.
And I would have thought it'd be the exact opposite. That's so interesting in terms of,
yeah, you would think that. But it seems to me that, for much of the second half of the 20th century, biology was dominated by genetics and this reductionistic approach to evolution in terms of tracking, certain genes through populations and whatnot. And for whatever reason, they didn't get the memo that physics had moved on from the mechanistic ontology. And so biologists were still imagining that they needed to somehow figure out how life could float atop a mechanistic universe, mechanistic processes at the physical level. And it turns out that mechanism doesn't work in physics. Biologists have been a little bit late to catch on to that. But yeah, more recently, especially with thinkers like Michael Levin and other biologists that I talk regularly to Timothy Jackson about these things. And as you were suggesting before we jumped on the call, I think formal and final causality, which have been ruled out of natural science since, Descartes or Francis Bacon, they're beginning to come back into the picture here because of the stunning capacity of cellular collectives to self-organize and to, as Michael Levin is now comfortable saying, to ingress form from another plane of existence he calls Platonic morphospace. So there's a lot of interesting metaphysical questions now being opened up by empirical science, which is really exciting for me as a philosopher.
Yes, and it's so interesting because I would have thought physics, that almost that reductionist model of science seems so physics driven in a sense of okay, we can just reduce biology to chemistry, reduce chemistry to physics, and then we'll have the law-like rules governing the entire universe and human behavior, and that'll be it. And so it's interesting that you say that that's moved on in physics, and now biology is kind of catching up to that, because it almost seemed mechanistically you could never explain biology entirely without ignoring goal-directed behavior and consciousness. Interesting example of this that I've been running into in my own research is in the field of attention in cognitive science. Because basically when you study the psychology and cognitive science of attention, it gets to this point where attention functions by what's relevant. So attention should be given to whatever is relevant. And then when you hit relevance, it's like, okay, well, that's scientifically, that's what it is. But then relevance is about value, it's about importance, it's about significance. And it turns out like attention is descriptively central in a person, but then it's also this normative thing. And so the end of the science pretty much runs into this value question. And so I think with biology and with like teleological creatures, or with they're capable of goal-directed behavior, it's almost unavoidable that you're going to run into this teleological question. Does that land okay for you? I mean, is that something you'd agree with, that it was like inevitable that they were going to get to this?
Yeah. I mean, on some level, if we go back to Immanuel Kant, in his third critique, and he talks about the purposiveness of organisms. For Kant, like, life doesn't even show up to you unless you have an idea of purpose or goal-directedness. That's kind of it is literally definitive. It's what defines life. Where, not only is it goal-directedness, but in the sense that, the organism is seeking food and avoiding prey, but the very morphology and metabolism and self-organizing dynamics that produce the body of an organism are very different from any kind of mechanical cause-effect relationship that you might find in the inorganic world. At least it's more prominent in the so-called inorganic world. And I think we could go into that more deeply, that actually even without even having to look at the level of biological organisms, I think there's evidence of formal and final causality just in the physical world. But putting that aside for the moment, I don't even think there really is a science of biology unless one is acknowledging the, let's say, heightened goal-directedness of these systems. And for much of, the 20th century, again, because of this reductionistic approach, somehow we ended up with a biology that didn't even acknowledge the existence of organisms. It was just all about, genes and fitness landscapes and population genetics and stuff. And I think bringing the organism back into biology is a really important step that I think is more widespread for sure. It's good to see that happening.
Yeah, and on causality, I mean, because Kant, this is Vervaeke's interpretation of Kant, but that he kind of concluded that biology was impossible because of Newtonian mechanics, basically, that you have this causality that's like, billiard ball, A hits B hits C. But if we look at the example of a tree, like a tree grows by a feedback cycle, the leaves spread out to take in more sunlight. The more sunlight, creates whatever photosynthesis, and that helps the tree grow, capture more sunlight. So you almost need another kind of causality, like what Alicia Uraro is bringing in with constraints and with self-organizing feedback cycles and these things to explain living things in the first place. Like, it doesn't work with the mechanistic model of Newton to explain how living things grow.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Kant thought that biology could only be descriptive. It couldn't be explanatory in the way that physics could be explanatory. And so that means he developed these, he called them like regulative principles for the descriptive study of life. That stems from the limitations that Kant places on our faculty of knowing, that we can only know phenomena that are determined by these categories of understanding. And he just didn't think we had the categories or the intuitions to really grok what's going on in organisms, because it's as if an idea is incarnate in the phenomenal world around us. And so that ideas are only supposed to be active in the human mind for Kant, but organisms suggest that there is some whole to part causality that is operative outside the human mind in these other and so that was mysterious to Kant. And I think a lot of the German idealists that followed in his wake, that developed a more organic cosmology and went beyond the epistemological limits that Kant put in place. They really exploited these intuitions that Kant had that he didn't or wasn't able to fully accept, I would say. There's kind of a crack in the Kantian firewall in the critique of judgment, where the self-organizing capacity of organisms is like suggesting a totally different understanding of knowledge and reality, and Kant just wasn't willing to follow up those possibilities. But Schelling, Goethe, Hegel, like they do follow that up, and I think there's a totally different philosophy of nature that spills out of what Kant kind of unwittingly discovered, but then backed away from. Alicia Rajaro and other like Francisco Varela before her. I mean, many thinkers have recognized that Kant did, in some sense, see the way forward, even if he wasn't able to follow that path himself.
And I'm also thinking, like, there was I had heard a few of your talks recently in terms of the Kantian, like, was his move, in a sense, did he moved things forward, but did he bring things back, in a sense, to almost a Platonic model? Like, because understanding Kant that he's trying to fuse, empiricism and rationalism, or trying to come up with this synthesis of it. And then, as you described, he ends up with this epistemological dualism where you have kind of our umwelt and then the thing in and of itself that we don't kind of get to. But he seems to put back in the driver's seat of epistemology the our perception of the world, in some sense, as not being ultimate. You know what I mean? Like, I'm thinking empiricist science, sense perception is passive reality coming into the senses. Whereas obviously for Plato in the Platonic tradition, sense experience was, it was the world of appearances, essentially. It almost seems like Kant does that, but then, unlike Plato, doesn't have this ladder from appearances to reality. Like, Kant just goes, it's only appearances. Like, we can't actually get to the real thing itself beyond that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, Kant is very Platonic in a sense that, he's saying that our sensory experience is a sort of cave wall with, the mind projecting onto it. But the major difference between Kant and Plato is Plato did allow for this kind of intellectual intuition, this kind of participation in the forms or in the noumena, the things themselves that Kant didn't allow. In the Critique of Judgment as well, Kant talks about the possibility of intellectual intuition and what he calls archetypal intellect, which would be like a divine intellect, that unlike our intellect, where there's a separation between the passive intuitive faculty and the active conceptual faculty, for an archetypal intellect or divine intellect, whatever that intellect thinks becomes real, right? And so this is something that Kant didn't think human beings were capable of, and Plato thought at least philosophers were capable of participating in the divine mind, in a sense. And, Plato had a lot to say about epistemology, but epistemology wasn't really first philosophy for Plato. Plato was less concerned with how we know. He was concerned with how we know, but more so with what there is to be known. And I think Kant got more caught in the first question, how do we know? And ended up kind of trapping himself in this perspective that we can't know reality as it is in itself.
Yeah, which creates, another dualism after the mind-body problem, which he was trying to deal with. But I guess the reason I'm bringing Plato in as well is obviously because of the forms. Like, if you're bringing in formal and final causes again, in some sense, do you have to bring in the forms? I know Michael Levin uses the language of the Platonic morphospace, although he seems kind of ambivalent about that, which is fair enough. It seems like, because for me, empirical science or mechanistic science wouldn't have any time for forms. Like, forms wouldn't be possible in that paradigm in some sense, because forms are, beyond the sensory. They're not, I don't know, they're not exactly empirical. Maybe you could argue they're rational in a sense of like mathematical forms, but they seem to be, I don't know, yeah, like do the forms even fit into empirical science? Like, do you see, what do you think about that?
Only as generalizations from experience. I mean, you can't do science without generalizations, but mechanistic science is nominalistic. And so those generalizations are not independently existing universals. They're just names, group names that we generalize from experiences of many particulars. And so from the in a mechanistic ontology, there are only particulars, and any wholes or any sort of universal categories are just names that human beings come up with to group things together, to group particulars together. And those names don't have any causal power, right? Other than semantically and the way we like form our sentences and stuff. They don't have any causal power in nature. They're just a matter of our perspective as human beings and how we categorize things. So that's the nominalist view that's dominated science for a long time. And what Mike is realizing, which Kant was also realizing, is that no, there's some kind of a form active, some kind of a wholeness active in organisms that isn't just a matter of our projection onto it. That wholeness exists for itself, and while we can come up with a mechanistic account of like, as Newton did, like how an apple falling from the tree is obeying the same universal law of gravitation as the planets orbiting around the sun. But for Newton, hundreds of years ago, there was still this theistic background to science, such that law of gravitation wasn't just, that universal, that law wasn't just a name that Newton came up with and projected onto nature. It's like, oh no, nature is lawful. Why is nature lawful? Well, there must be some kind of a former, a creator of form behind nature that would explain these laws and this systematic unity of nature as a whole, such that it would be law-abiding. But then gradually, mechanistic science continued to do its thing with the theological presuppositions underlying it kind of fading away and being forgotten about, which doesn't... It starts to make the whole scientific enterprise seem rather mysterious when you remove that theological background, because then what's the epistemological foundation? And Kant already is taking major steps in the direction of not requiring such an explicit theological foundation, but you still get it in his work as well. It's just more on the side of moral philosophy. But, the real question for biologists is not so much what is the law explaining how the apple falls from the tree, but what is the law explaining how the apple got up there in the first place? Like, what is the formative and final teleological cause that gives rise to this tree and this process, this life cycle? And that's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, I might pause on that as well, because thinking about the formal causality, because like, okay, we've got the efficient causality, billiard ball. How did the forms cause? Because for Plato, I mean, my reading of him anyway is really that, like, the example he gives in Book 10 of the Republic of a bed is like the image of the bed really is the cause of the physical bed and the creation of, like, it's in some sense the physical bed can't exist, the particular can't exist without the universal. It's in a dependency relationship, but then also in a kind of a downward causality. I'm thinking about like his analogy of the sun as the good illuminates the world of the forms that allows the person leaving the cave to see them. Like, that's a kind of causality or an enabling constraint or something like that. That seems to be, well, I don't know, hard to account for in the current paradigm. Are you okay with that description of formal causality? Would you change it? Like, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's kind of like what becomes epistemological in Kant is cosmological in Plato, by which I mean Plato, like in his dialogue Timaeus, describes the creation of the universe, or at least the ingression of form into a chaos, into something unformed. And Plato describes the demiurge and the realm of forms that provide the demiurge with the sort of prototype to mold the physical world as a copy of that prototype of that realm of forms. Whereas in Kant, all of that gets sort of sequestered into the human mind. And so rather than there being a cosmic demiurge, there's there's reason. And reason is like stamping the material of our sensory experience with these categories, right? And so there's so many structural parallels between Kant and Plato. It's just that Kant's squeezed the whole Platonic cosmos into the human mind, in a sense.
You see that really in active inference as well. I don't want to go down that tangent, but that really is connected there in terms of like the priors and beliefs structuring like our experience of objects, and that, the brain and nervous system are in the body. And so we're using these goals or drives or whatever you want to call them to guess at the causes of our sensory experience. It's very Kantian in that sense. But Plato isn't really, for Plato, these things are real outside of our heads. And I suppose there has to, even for Kant, I suppose there is reality behind it. He just doesn't think that we can access it in some sense.
Yeah. I mean, one way to understand this that I find handy is coming from Anderson Weeks, who's a philosopher, Whiteheadian philosopher, and he talks about the main difference between sort of ancient Platonic philosophy and modern sort of post-Cartesian philosophy has to do with the subject-object relationship. And for Plato, it wasn't the subject that was shabby or limited. It was the objects. The sensory objects were shabby and always changing and never the same. But in modern philosophy, like after Descartes, that shifts, and it's not the objects, the sensory objects that are shabby that present the problem for philosophy. It's the shabby subject. And so it's all about developing rules for more epistemological rigor to improve how the subject perceives the world. And so it becomes more subject focused in modern philosophy, from Descartes through to Kant and afterwards. So there's the shift from, Plato's concern with shabby objects to Descartes and Kant's concern with shabby subjects. It's like, how do we, for Kant, it's like, well, we need better hygiene, better epistemological hygiene in a sense. But yeah, the thing with Plato is that, the forms take preeminence, and they do seem to have this downward causal influence on the physical world. And there are other ways of construing formal causality that aren't just one directional like that. And that's Whitehead. He's a Platonist, but he's inverting Plato's emphasis on the forms as the preeminent reality, and instead recognizing that, yes, we do need to reference these eternal objects. We need to check this nominalistic impulse to reduce everything to particulars. But at the same time, what really has value and the locus of value is in individual occasions of experience, not in the universals, not in the forms. But those individual occasions of experience need to draw on the forms in order to define themselves, in order to have any definiteness or character at all, right? And so I think we can reverse the emphasis in terms of where the value is realized and avoid this Platonic overemphasis, I think, on another world. But we still need to make reference to forms, even so.
Yes, and because your point as well about the difference between ancient philosophy and modern philosophy is something there that's coming up, is that the loss of the good, really, because the good for Plato is the guarantor of the forms. Like, the forms aren't the realest thing in terms of his schema. The realest thing is the good, and that's what is, causally significant, or the unhypothetical first principle, as he calls it. And in modern philosophy, the good is very absent. Like Descartes' pursuit of just like absolute certainty within his mind would have seemed ridiculous really in a world with the guarantee of the good, which is that like there's a rational order of the cosmos and our minds are capable of grasping it, you know, that intelligibility and reality are wedded, logos and ontos, which was Plato's first principle, I think, in that argument, in the good, and that, but that first principle became lost in a sense of like that doesn't cut the cheese anymore. We need like you know, some sort of, I don't know, account. Do you think that's fair in a sense?
Yeah, well, so Descartes really does emphasize divine power over, you know, goodness and truth and so on, because, you know, for Descartes, it's not that 2 + 2 = 4 for some logical reason, that's how those forms relate. It's because, you know, God could change that if God wanted to. God could make 2 + 2 = 7 because God's all powerful. Whereas for Plato, God was limited by the logical relations of the forms. So similarly, right, in the Euthyphro, it's like God is good because it's good. The good is not good because God says so. But
that's I'm telling you that like divine command problem of like, is it good because he commands it, or does he command it because it's good? But for Plato, I think God is the good. Like it's not like a separate thing.
Right.
Okay.
Whereas for Descartes, which is a consequence of nominalism, actually, because nominalism began with the theological motivation to not restrict God's power. Because if there are these universals with a definite character to them, God is limited by the logical relations of those universals. And these medieval Christian theologians were like, oh, we can't have God limited by ideas. And, you know, so ideas must just be names. And eventually nominalism becomes the justification for mechanism and reductionism. And so, yeah, Descartes is, you know, he'll still make reference to the benevolence of God. I mean, that becomes Whitehead jokes in Process and Reality that Descartes needs an insurance. He needs to take out an insurance policy with God in order to establish his the possibility of our knowledge of nature. Like, why is it that the representations in our mind line up with the extended world? Well, because God is good and wouldn't deceive us at that level. So there's still reference to the divine goodness in Descartes, but ultimately divine power takes the cake.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting slip, like that changes as time goes on. Because obviously, yeah, like nominalism starts within Christianity, which is like, I don't even understand how you could understand like a classical theism with nominalism. Like it doesn't really, I mean, it seems so counterintuitive. But for Plato, that the good, I think, that underlies truth and knowledge and is the foundation of all, like the unhypothetical assumption. D.C. Schindler, I don't know if you've read his book, Plato's Critique of Impure Reason.
No.
Should definitely, man, he's like unbelievably good. But he makes that argument in it, that in a sense that because you can't provide a reason for reason, or you can't provide a rational argument for rational arguments because it's circular. Rationality and reason has to be underlied by something else, which he argues is the good, this unhypothetical first principle, which is that there is this connection between intelligibility and reality. Otherwise, you know, we can't know anything, or we can't, you know, argue for any truth, and it becomes almost it's like you can't argue for it because every argument presupposes it. But if you argue against it, you know, if the argument's true, then it's possible we know truth, so it's true. So it's like this weird, like, Chinese finger trap that you kind of can't get, like, around in some sense. And I think in the modern philosophy, they broke that out of it. And so we end up, like, what is the hypothetical? What is the first principle? What is the guarantor of, like, that our minds are such that we're capable of truth and that there's an order to reality?
Yeah. Yeah, we've somehow lost track of the fact that the scientific interest in truth is itself the expression of value, right? And so if there isn't an ontological ground for value in the universe, then it pulls the rug right out from under the scientific process of inquiry, because that makes our interest in truth totally arbitrary. And you kind of see this happening with Donald Hoffman, and maybe this is more the way that
reality isn't real.
Yeah, I think it's a kind of reductio, like where if you take evolution seriously, then and you don't have any kind of ontological good or any sort of Platonic sense of the forms of the good, the true, and the beautiful, then all you take is evolution as this random searching process, then yeah, that undermines the scientific enterprise, because we're just animals that have contingently evolved just to survive, not to know the truth. And so if you take the mechanistic nominalistic picture of the universe seriously, you end up with Donald Hoffman's perspective. It's perfectly consistent from that point of view, but if you push it a little bit further, I feel like it's self-undermining, because how do you know that all the models you're developing to prove that we don't know the truth are true? Like, so
totally ultimate skepticism, isn't it? Like, it just undermines itself, really. If ultimate skepticism is true, it's false, because like we can know about ultimate skepticism and you end up in this weird, like, trying to. But I think like Donald Hoffman is a perfect example where like he should be a Platonist. Like, he's kind of got to the point where it's like, okay, yeah, sense perception isn't like passive reality straight through the senses. And Plato would be like, yeah, definitely. That's why we need to go on this journey, like a virtue epistemology, or like a transformative kind of journey to see degrees of truth, or to scale up degrees of truth, in a sense. Like, Plato wouldn't stop there, I think, and just be like, oh yeah, it's, we can't know anything.
And in Hoffman's defense, I know he has responses to these sorts of criticisms, and his view of reality ultimately being made of conscious agents at different levels, I think, is moving in the right direction. At least it's just the way that
totally, yeah,
the videos, the interviews he does, the way they get titled, and the sort of summary statements he'll make, these catchy phrases. I feel like it just is playing into this global skepticism that's not really helpful.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah, the thumbnails, man, are just, reality is an illusion, and yeah, they're not good. But yeah, I mean, getting to that point then, I suppose, of like the limits of perception, because even that, like, the evolutionary argument against naturalism is coming up, like Alvin Plantinga's thing, that yeah, it seems like if you get to that point, we need some account of reality, but we can't really argue for it rationally. So it's like, how do we ground our pursuit of truth in that sense? I mean, I was going to ask you to describe a little bit, like, truth. You wrote a great essay recently that I read, truth as correspondence, and then truth as coherence, and then moving to truth as participation. So maybe that would be a good place to kind of discuss, because I think really that we're talking about truth as participation, in a sense, what it's participating in. I don't know if you'd agree with it as truth as aletheia or truth as disclosure. Like, it seems to be truth as, approaching what's real, rather than just correspondence. But maybe, yeah, could we say a little bit about that, and like, yeah, does it connect to what we've been discussing?
Yeah. I mean, Plato's highest form of knowing is intuition, not Kant's sense of intuition, but more like intellectual intuition, noesis, which is participation instead of there being a subject-object differentiation, there's a identification of the knower and the known at that highest level. And in our contemporary scientific context, there's this problem or principle, the anthropic principle, right? That there are different ways of rendering it, but we could say we could only come to know that universe that was capable of producing us. And so when we are mystified by the fine tuning of the fundamental constants and all of that, it's just some readings of the anthropic principle would say, well, that's an artifact of this coincidence that, we exist in this universe that created us. And so, of course, it's going to seem fine-tuned to create us. And so there's this tension between being overly anthropomorphic and being overly anthropocentric on the other hand. And I think truth as participation is an attempt to thread the needle there, where we recognize that, well, we do live in an anthropic universe. This universe created us. And it's clear from cognitive science, like, of course, we have the tendency to project our own humanness onto the world. Like, we want to see faces everywhere and agency everywhere because we're sort of hardwired, to do that. But on the other hand, if we go to the opposite extreme and say, well, all mind, all agency, all consciousness is just unique to the human being. It only exists within human skulls, and the rest of the universe is totally lacking anything like that. Well, that kind of anthropocentrism is also problematic. And so the participatory approach to truth is to say, hey, human beings are not exceptions. We are exemplifications of these deeper cosmological principles. And when we talk about truth, it's more of an event. Aletheia works well here. It's an event of disclosure. And yes, we live in an evolutionary universe such that, the universe is never the same twice. And so what was true yesterday might not be true tomorrow, right? So truth as an event means we are ourselves co-creators of the truth. And there are elements of correspondence and elements of coherence. But I think this view of participation goes further because it breaks us out of having to decide, is truth just lining up my inner concepts with something that's external and separate from me? Or is truth just a matter of getting my concepts to fit together in a coherent way? Those are elements of what's required for truth, but there's a deeper synergy and identification of knower and known that the participatory form of truth acknowledges. And on the one hand, there's something here for everybody. Like, there's a correspondence element, there's a coherence element. And so partisans of those theories of truth should be able to come part of the way here. But there's also a big ask because it requires acknowledging that truth is not just out there waiting for us to find it, nor is it just something that we construct internally. It really does ask something of us. It asks us to take a risk in a way of opening ourselves to something that will change us. And so it's not just truth that could be objectified out there in an empirical way or objectified logically. It's something that changes us as persons, right? And so it becomes, I think, a relationship to truth as something that has a more religious or spiritual quality to it. Like, it's a value that requires something of us as knowers, right? Whereas I think science in the modern period has thought of truth as just value neutral and like the facts don't care about your feelings, like that type of attitude. Well, it could be that we have to comport ourselves appropriately to the truth, and that there is a sort of emotional and affective dimension to that comportment, right? It's not just cognitive. So
yes, and that, like, because with science, obviously, there's a method that can be applied impersonally by anybody. It's actually probably better if you're not involved in it, in a sense. Like, the more you're not involved in it, the more true it can be. Like, if there's any kind of human interference, like, it's not true. That makes sense for the scientific method, but in truth as participation, it seems more like a transformation. It's more like a thing you have to actually participate in order to have this insight into what's real, or to have a kind of transform, which is very Platonic in a sense. I think Plato was really, if you look at the cave anyway, that's his argument of like ascending these levels of being, like true philosophy is the move from appearance to reality, of almost getting through levels of, and then I suppose his language is beholding the good or beholding what's most real. Like he doesn't think that we have like a concept of it or that we, capture it in some theory or something like that. Like I think for him, it's really an experience, almost like the beatific vision in a sense in Christianity, like that these kind of experiences are where we connect to what's most real. And so, that's the job of truth seeking in some senses, to get to that kind of insight, which is very personal and very, risky.
Exactly. And there's a place for, science as the correct representation of factual information. But I think truth in this higher capital T sense is more, as in the Platonic sense that you're speaking to, it's more like the virtuous transformation of the knower, right? It's not just correct representation of information, but it's requiring us to transform, right? And it brings this question of the virtue of the knower to the forefront. That, like, you see this in, the post-Kantian thinkers like Goethe, where his way of relating empathically to the growth of plants or any natural phenomenon that he was studying, there was a certain moral disposition that one had to take to actually lovingly relate to the phenomenon, which revealed aspects of that phenomenon that wouldn't otherwise be apparent to us if we objectified it, right? And so all of a sudden, that subject-object boundary and that sense that facts and values are separate, it really breaks down. When again, and this is part of recognizing the human being as ourselves. I mean, you could put it different ways, as ourselves a natural phenomenon. We are an example of what we are studying, right? And that means all of our aims, our values, our consciousness is an exemplification of what nature also is doing, right? And granting nature the sort of interiority that we have, I think, is a prerequisite for this deeper kind of participation.
Oh man, there's so much stuff coming up there. Like, I was reading recently, I don't know if you know James Filler.
Only through work. John Vervaeke's dialogues with him. I haven't. Yeah, I need to read these guys. Schindler and Filler,
his substance ontology, or his critique, he's trying to move to a relational ontology. I think it fits very well with the process stuff as well. But he argues that Plato has a virtue epistemology, in a sense that we know the real by becoming virtuous. And I think with the ancient worldview, they had this premise that, we were a microcosm of the macrocosm, in a sense. So by it almost like becoming more, I don't know, ordered or something, I don't know if that's the right word, or more true, more good, more beautiful or something like that, we became like the reality, and that's by becoming. John has that conformity theory of knowing, which is like that you, I suppose, indwell or become like the thing in order to understand it, rather than just being able to represent it. But that seems like something we've really lost. And in active inference, I'd be interested in getting your opinion on this. The generative modeling, I think, brings back the idea of microcosms and macrocosms, because to be a good model of the environment is to be essentially to have an image of the environment or a model of the environment. And, the biggest environment is, reality. I don't know if you think that, sorry, I'm throwing a lot at you here, but that train of thought of, microcosm, macrocosm, and then that there's a journey in between.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think there's a lot of promise in free energy principle, active inference, predictive processing, because there's clearly a dimension of our cognition that is about anticipation. And I think, from my point of view as a process philosopher, it's just important to balance the two poles of experience. There's anticipation, but there's also confirmation to the past. And, every moment of experience in the life history of an organism is about, balancing confirmation to the past and anticipation of the future. And in some sense, that's about finding the proper balance between efficient causality and final causality. Both are real. So the point that, we've been talking about how science is taking on board the reality of final causes again. The point's not to jettison efficient causes as a result of that and, try to explain everything as a result of teleology. There is a push from behind and there is a lure from up ahead. And I think, it's, while the ancient world and the scholastic philosophers were maybe overemphasizing final causality, downplaying efficient causality, mechanistic scientific revolution for the last few hundred years overemphasized efficient causality and didn't have much room for final. We want the proper balance. But yeah, in terms of, microcosm, macrocosm, that hermetic principle, I think, is so important because it seems to be true in terms of certain like holographic interpretations of what's going on in quantum physics, and the sense in which information is available in the cosmos, such like every point in the universe is a reflection of every other point in the universe. And so, this principle seems to apply physically, but also understanding the deeper meaning of the human being. Again, rather than seeing us as some special anomaly that doesn't fit into our picture of the rest of the universe. I really do think we need to recover this ancient hermetic sense of the human being as a mirror of the cosmos, as the universe in microcosmic form, because then again we can look to the study of our own nature as a source of insight into the rest of nature, the human being as exemplar of deeper cosmic principles rather than as an exception to them. And there are naive and silly ways of recuperating this principle, but I think there are also really rigorous ways of doing it that allow us to bring epistemology back into contact with reality, so that we don't end up where some accounts of the predictive processing for energy principle stuff, where they go in this skeptical direction, where all of our conscious experience is just a hallucination. I think we need to check that tendency of thought by grounding ourselves in this deeper understanding of the microcosm macrocosm relationship, and that and you can get there very easily through active inference, because as far as I can tell, in terms of the formalism of the model, you can just as easily say that, just as you could say organisms are modeling the environment, you could say that an organism is the environment's model of itself, right? So you can invert an organism and environment and who's modeling you quite easily here. And so there's that microcosm macrocosm relationship right there.
Yeah, the other way around. Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it's kind of coming, when you bring in the generative modeling in some way, it's hard to avoid really, because it brings in this level of like building an image of the environment that you're I don't know, it's the adaptation of the environment in a kind of evolutionary way, but also an internalization of the environment that can be, beneficial and like in human environments, obviously our environments are mostly they're cultural in creation, so we're internalizing the norms of social functioning and these things like that are becoming part of our generative modeling, and then obviously we're changing that as well and creating it, so we're co-creating in both ways. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to push that too far, but you mentioned something about the proper balance of efficient and final cause. This is something I was wrestling with recently. Did a podcast on Plato's Timaeus with Dr. Peter Larson. He's a expert in ancient philosophy who works at DCU with me in Dublin. And he had singled out this part of the Timaeus, I think it's 68 to 69, of Plato's identification of divine causes and necessary causes. His two kinds of causality, and that it needs to be, he actually says that we ought to look at the necessary causes in order to understand the divine ones, which was something we were chewing on, which is really weird. That he seems to put like natural service or natural science in the service of understanding the divine forms or understanding the good. Like there's something there. But I mean, how do you see the relationship between the efficient causes and the final causes? Yeah.
Great question. And that's funny. You were just talking about the Timaeus. I just did a video on the Timaeus as well.
I know I started watching it actually. It was the same week, interestingly, so quite synchronous.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that our English translation of the Greek ananke, I think, is this as necessity. It's almost an inversion of the meaning of that term in Greek, in the sense that I think Plato meant something more like chance, the unruly, the wild, that which can't be subsumed by rationality and form. Whereas when we say necessity nowadays, it seems more like mechanism. It seems more like, deterministic causality. And I think for Plato, it had a different connotation. It was associated with the quora and the receptacle, right? This very dark and mysterious, what's it call it? Matrix, that is almost something like the form of formlessness, you might say. And so,
whoa, that's like a Zen koan.
Yeah. And so I guess you could relate necessity to efficient causality, as long as you don't reduce efficient causality to mechanistic causality.
Well, that might be it, because that was another thing we talked, was the problem of reading Aristotle's causes into Plato's ones in the Timaeus, because I was kind of doing that reflexively, and then Peter was like, there might not be the same thing, and he was like, he thinks Plato's causality would be that they're all kind of efficient causes in the way that Aristotle means them, but obviously, like with formal causes, that the forms exert some kind of forceful cause almost on the matter, But I guess the difficulty of reading in Aristotle's ones to those, I mean, Plato could mean something, entirely different.
Sometimes the form of formlessness, or the receptacle in the Timaeus, can be thought of as equivalent to what Aristotle will later call hule, or matter. But I think that misses something that's still active in Plato's account of the receptacle. Like literally, the receptacle has some activity to it. It's not simply passive matter as it is in Aristotle. It's almost like Aristotle domesticates Plato's receptacle, and it just becomes this substratum awaiting form. Whereas in Plato's Timaeus, the receptacle has this vibratory quality to it. It's already like winnowing the four elements to order them in a certain way before the demiurge gets involved. And so there's something really weird going on in Plato's account of, if we want to call it materiality, that makes materiality still kind of active or animate in Plato. Whereas in Aristotle, matter loses that. It's just pure passivity. But yeah, I think Plato did seem to conceive of form nonetheless as like something that the divine mind stamps onto this receptacle, despite this other weirdness going on with the receptacle having its own agency or activity of some kind. And there are, in the Timaeus, I should say, there are multiple accounts of the process of creation. And I think the first account is much more what we usually associate with Platonism, where the divine mind is like stamping the forms onto matter. But it's in the second attempt, Timaeus, the astronomer, starts over and says, let me try that again. And you give this likely story. And in that second account, then the receptacle has more of this agency, and he's working with the difficulty of necessity. I mean, in some ways, the whole dialogue is about the unruliness of that which resists reason, of that which resists intellectual explanation. And like, it's such a brilliant dialogue. Like, you get this in the first line where, Socrates counts like 1, 2, 3, where's the fourth? And then I forget the other interlocutors, like, oh, he's sick. He got ill. What is illness?
The fourth doesn't show up.
The fourth doesn't show up because of illness. He wouldn't willingly have missed this conversation, but illness, necessity, in other words, that aspect of materiality that we can't rationally control, prevented him from being there, right? And so already you get the sense for what Plato is struggling with in this dialogue.
Yeah, Timaeus is a sequel to the Republic. In a sense, it's like the second part of the Republic, or like after the Republic gives this account of like, politics, and then epistemology and ontology, and then he goes to the cosmology. Because for some reason I'm thinking at the end, obviously, of the Republic, you have the myth of and the spindle of necessity. It's like crazy image, man, of this like, ginormous kind of hyper object or something that's like spinning together all of the. It's almost like an ordering structure, but also something to do with fate and determinism and this strange kind of idea. Do you think that's connected to what he's talking about with necessity? I mean,
yeah, I mean, it's certainly related to fate. But again, I think there's a connection that's easy for us to lose between fate and chance, like drawing lots, and like you never know what fate has in store for you, so it can seem kind of chancy. But it's different from our, I think, conception in the modern period of deterministic mechanism or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the proper approach here is, from my Whiteheadian point of view, is not to think of form as like the influence of form on evolution, on development, as a kind of another efficient cause. Like I wouldn't want to go that direction. I would want to understand form as formal causality is a kind of lure. It doesn't force anything to occur. It's more like in each moment of our experience, certain possibilities are available to us, and depending on our past and our present situation, we will reach for a different set of adjacent possibilities to realize, and we can't reduce those adjacent possibilities to matter or to something in our past. It's like there really are these forms, but they're not themselves the agents that are reaching in to stamp us to take on their shapes. We are reaching towards them, I would say. And so the agency is with the organism. And this is a conversation I've been having with Mike Levin, because he seems more prone to want to give agency to the forms themselves.
That they're reaching in some sense.
Yeah.
Pulling
and maybe
them.
But Whitehead's view is more to give the agency to actualities that are making the decisions as to which forms to draw upon moment by moment. But the forms still have to have a kind of ontological definiteness in their own right. And so Whitehead still maintains the tension between actuality and possibility, but he doesn't want possibility to have agency. That seems to him.
Yeah. Is that like giving counterfactuals an agency in some way? Like you'd have like if I have a goal to be a football player, and like the dream of being a football player constrains my behavior now. So it in that sense, it influences what I do, but it doesn't like efficient causality me in a sense. Yeah. It just limits the.
You could still call it a cause,
as the cause for sure, but
it's not the agent. Yeah.
No. But then again, is there a relationship between the agent and the dream? Like, why, like being a football player over being something else, like, I don't know, a scuba diver or something? Like, is there between that goal, that ideal vision of the future state that constrains the behavior now, you know, has something particular to the agent in a way that makes it motivational? But then there's also a universal element in that it's a good. Maybe everybody wouldn't consider it good, but I'm kind of trying to gesture at, is there a two-way thing there a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the forms have to make themselves attractive to the agents who are deciding among them, right? And so, to the extent that that attractiveness is a form of causation. I mean, if in Whitehead, all of the forms are held in and envisaged by the primordial nature of God, and for Whitehead, God is another actual entity, and so in some sense, you could say that through God, these forms have efficient causation, but the efficient cause is God, not the forms, and that efficient cause also is not determining of what each organism decides to do. It's still a lure. Sure, it has agency as a lure. It just doesn't have agency in the way that a physical force might, right?
Yes. And is the lore then behind it because I guess for Plato the lore would be the good behind the form. So like there's almost like in the cave you're called almost by the light, the fire, which is like, a representation of the light of the good to get to the forms. Then you look from the forms up to the source of the light, and then you get to this kind of, event horizon, in a sense that you can't get beyond this, infinite that you behold. But in some sense, that experience orders your understanding of everything else. Like it puts things in perspective. But that the good is present at each level of the higher, like even in the cave, the good is there in some sense. Like it's got that causal influence, and so you could kind of follow it up in a sense. It's luring by being the cause. I don't know if that makes sense. Like if you're following to the cause of reality or what's real, it's there necessarily.
Yeah. I mean, it's similar. God functions similarly to the good in Whitehead's philosophy as the ultimate object of desire. I mean, that's starting to sound like Aristotle's God too, but there are parallels there. It's Whitehead also has his consequent nature of God, which is what allows for there to be a more evolutionary process here, which I think Plato is actually way closer to an evolutionary picture than Aristotle, who has a sense of Aristotle's cosmos is uncreated and eternal, whereas Plato's Timaeus describes the incoming of a new form of order into chaos. There's already matter in the Timaeus. There's already the receptacle before creation by the demiurge, unfolds, right? And so it's a very different picture that's, I think, more evolutionary.
Yeah, okay. It doesn't have an unmoved mover at the start of it. There was one thing, it's a bizarre one to finish on, so apologies, but I was, during your conversation with Ruth, I can't remember her last name actually,
Kastner.
We were talking about Kastner, yes, the great conversation as well. I need to read some more of her work. It seemed really interesting in terms of the physics. Obviously can't understand a lot of physics, but it seemed very cool. And you were talking about atemporal things, and I wondered, had you heard of Terence McKenna's idea of a transcendental hyper object at the end of time? This kind of blur beyond space time.
Yes, it's actually from Terence McKenna that I first heard of Whitehead. When I was a 18 or 19-year-old, I was listening to a lot of McKenna's lectures, and the time wave zero hypothesis and model and the transcendental hyperobject at the end of time is, I think, McKenna's reading of both Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's Omega Point and, Whitehead's understanding of the consequent nature of God, which are somewhat different ideas, related, but McCann sort of mashes them together and adds some of his cannabis-fueled Irish bard genius to it. And I think, has a compelling vision that, unfortunately, well, I used to think, maybe back in 2015, it was like, I guess that whole 2012 thing was a big nothing burger. But looking back, I'm like, now things do seem like they've gotten really, really weird since then. maybe something did happen.
Actually, that's maybe the Mayans were onto something, to be honest.
So I'm revisiting that one, actually.
Yeah. Okay, well, I mean, I guess to finish up, because in theory this was a conversation about truth. I mean, obviously we've had to go into so many other areas, because when you talk about truth, it's impossible not to discuss these other things, really. And so, I wonder how would you, I don't know if I want to say define truth for people, but how would you help somebody to think about this version of truth, that we've moved on to something else? Like, did they participate in, the good, or in this, account? What's the significance of this change of truth? I think is a good place to end.
Yeah, that it requires something of us, that there's something ecstatic about participation in the truth. You have to get outside of your comfort zone, your settled sense of identity, and put yourself at risk to be transformed by the world, right? And so it's moving out of this sense of truth as just something static out there waiting for us to find, and more like something that we need to co-create, and that we are in turn created by. It's not just that we're creating the truth, we are created by the truth at the same time. And so we have to risk ourselves and recognize truth as, etymologically it's related to trust, right? And so it's about trusting the universe to unveil itself to us, but that unveiling can't and won't occur until we are virtuous enough that it trusts us, right? And so it's more about building a relationship to the world, to other people, to other forms of life, accepting that truth is not just information, right? It's about forming ourselves so as to be worthy of that revelation.
Thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate it, man. That was awesome.
Yeah. I enjoyed it. Thanks, Mahon.